This video will likely be shared. I think it's important that people have these conversations. I think unfortunately there's a lot of brokers and there's a lot of people that are just not really paying attention to what's coming, and they're just going to wait and see what happens. And I don't think that's a good thing. But I think even for the ones that are being proactive, I think having different voices, different opinions can be helpful. It'll make you think about things in different ways. And so that's why we open this up to everyone. That's why we have no problem sharing this video with people. And I appreciate all of you coming here. We've got, just so any of y'all haven't picked up on this yet, we made this training open to everyone. So we're going to have some agents that do not belong to our company that are at this training. And that's a good thing. Like, I don't think that's, hang on. Lost my screen there for a second. That's a good thing. I don't think that that's a negative at all. In fact, I think that's a positive thing. I want them to feel welcome, and I want to feel like they can ask questions just like anybody else could. If you don't work for our company, and quite honestly, even if you do, please fact check any of these things that I'm going to tell you with your personal broker. You know, we've got a lot of offices all over the place. I'm not the broker of your office. And so, you know, fact check them with your broker, get second opinions on these things. You know, don't take my word and say, well, this guy Grant told me to do this, because, you know, you don't work for me. We will be sharing all the documents that we have created with our attorneys to be used, like everything that we've updated for what's coming in August. We've updated all that. We've had it looked at by several attorneys, and we're going to share those when we start talking about those documents, but we're not going to do that up front. We're just more so going to talk about what this is about and kind of what's coming. Anybody is welcome to take a look at those documents. You're more than welcome to download them. Please don't just reuse our documents, but if you want to take them and make some minor changes and use them as your own, you are more than welcome to do so.
Let me pause you just and jump in real quick, Grant.
Sure, of course.
Hey everyone, it's Kelly. For those agents that are within the 1% list company, we have already had a meeting with your brokers. We had that last week, so they have already been privy to these documents that y'all are going to see. It is going to be solely up to your brokers as far as what documents they are wanting to use, if they are going to have to make any changes to documents, or if they elect to make any changes to documents. So you definitely need to speak directly with them, because ultimately it's their call.
Yep. And look, there are some states that are requiring certain documents, which kind of makes me nervous, because look, who am I to weigh in on any of those things? But as an outsider, I will say this: when the lawsuits came down, they were suing brokerages, and in some instances, they were suing like real estate teams. And so here's the thing: if a state is going to require you to use a certain document, then you kind of have to use it. But if that document they are requiring you to use opens you up to, you know, potential legal problems from your clients, then that's kind of a gray area. We're like, hey, I didn't necessarily want to use this document. They made me. So I always advise you to listen to your broker, follow your state's rules and regulations. But I think we're going to see more things shake out from that. Because I know I would feel a certain way if Louisiana said, sorry, this is the document you have to use, and then I get sued for using that document. I'd probably feel a certain way about that. But anyways, feel free to download the documents once we put them up, make changes, and, you know, whatever. Just please don't copy and paste, and, you know, just don't do that. I would appreciate it. This training has some things that might be specific to my home state of Louisiana, but the overarching principles of this apply everywhere. Okay. So I'm going to share a link to download some of these documents shortly, but to get started, let's go over some key points as to the backdrop for these changes and what has taken place. I think a lot of people in the industry, they need to see these changes because they only look at things through the perspective of a real estate agent. And for a lot of us, we've been a real estate agent for a very long time. And so it's hard for us to take off our real estate agent hat. You know, like, I don't know, imagine, maybe this would be a weird analogy, but imagine I was going to get my car serviced somewhere, and I the guy servicing my car would probably have a hard time going into extreme detail of making me understand what he's doing. You know what I'm saying? Because he's a mechanic. This is what he does. And so I think it's important for us to obviously be professional and know our jobs inside out, but it's also up to us to realize that the people that we're representing don't. And a lot of those people, they're not going to see things the way we see them because frankly, they haven't walked the same road that we've walked. You know, your average client sells a house once every 7 years. You know, I think pretty much everybody here is selling a lot more than one house every 7 years. So we can't expect them to know what they know. A great example of this, really the perfect example of this, which is why a lot of these things are taking place, is I saw after these lawsuits came down that literally there was agents everywhere saying everyone knows commissions are negotiable. And I know we've been taught that in real estate classes, but I've never seen that advertised anywhere. I've never seen a brokerage come out and say that commissions are negotiable. In fact, I've seen most try to not negotiate it. So why should we expect the public to understand something in real estate school that they've never seen? Does anybody get where I'm going there? It's like the public has not gone through real estate school to be told that real estate commissions are negotiable. And I would challenge any of you to show me where in the world any brokerage has advertised that commissions are negotiable. So why should they think they are negotiable? And that's why there's been major changes coming down the pipe where we have to put that in our documents now. You know, we have to make that bold and clear, and you'll see that in our documents in just a second. It's very important to understand who you are representing in a transaction. And I'm going to use a real world example of this in just a minute. But unless you're acting in a situation in which dual agency is allowed, you are either acting on behalf of the seller or the buyer. And it's your fiduciary to act on their behalf. I've seen a lot of people make comments saying, you know, it almost alludes to the fact that they are looking out for the other agent or looking out for the industry or looking out for themselves. I mean, I won't share the name, but I'll read this to you. This came to me earlier today. There was somebody asking questions about ministerial acts and things like that. And somebody literally told me these exact words. This isn't rocket science. Agents just need to get with the program. Buyers will sign an agreement if the agent knows how to articulate their value and don't have this mindset. Also, as a listing agent, I'm not doing double the work for half the pay. My DocuSign is not free. My opinion is not free. My franchise tools and tech are not free. My time is not free. A buyer will not get any of that from me without agreeing to pay me. Okay, this is how agents approach this. This is how agents should approach this. The buyer doesn't want to pay me, cool. Here's an email of the contract, figure out how to print it, write what you wanted, figure out a price yourself and send it back to me, hopefully before a buyer wants to pay me or another agent sends me something worth accepting. Okay, so the problem with that is, what happens if you have a seller who is getting transferred and they have to sell this house or they're going to be stuck in an apartment with their family? And this agent is basically saying, yeah, you hired me to be your fiduciary and help sell my house, but sorry, this person is not willing to sign up that they're going to pay me for this. So I'm going to tell them to kick rocks until a better buyer comes along. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. If you're hired by the seller, you're supposed to represent your seller. If you're hired by your buyer, you're supposed to represent your buyer. The reason these lawsuits happen is because those lines got incredibly blurred. Okay. And that's why these changes have come about. Does anybody disagree with any of that? Does anybody have any questions on that? Like if you're hired by a seller to sell a house, you should not be telling any buyer that doesn't want to sign a certain document, sorry, you can go away. I'm going to wait. As the listing agent, I've chosen to wait until a buyer that wants to do X, Y, and Z comes along. No.
Grant, I have something real quick,
sure,
if you don't mind.
Please.
So I had a unique situation like this happen where I have a $2 million listing and a buyer called me for my sign and they said, we'd like to see the property. Do you have an agent? No, we don't have an agent. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Well, technically right now you have to sign this buyer agency agreement before I can even show it to you.
Mhm.
Like, so now what am I supposed to tell my seller that's like, hey, they won't sign this buyer agency agreement in place, I can't show them the property?
You could. Here's the thing. You could send them a document or send them something making it incredibly clear that you're not representing them and they have refused to sign a buyer rep agreement, but you are acting on the best interest of your seller and opening the door for them to see the property. You could
Is
have
that allowed right now? Are we allowed to do that, like a touring?
Here's the thing. I think that once again, this is getting into some gray areas, but your job is to represent your seller, and your
Correct.
job is to get the house sold. And so if they say, well, I'm not signing a buyer rep agreement and I want to see this house, I think you send it to them. Maybe you send it to them with 0% on it. But you send it to them so you make sure they've seen it and you get something in writing. You send them an email or text message saying, just want to make sure you understand you've made it clear that you do not want representation, but my fiduciary is to my seller and I'm going to open this door because if you want to write an unrepresented offer, then we're going to win. You can do that.
Hey, Grant,
Yes.
Zillow seems to have solved that issue with a showing form that's readily downloadable now, where it obligates not the agent nor the prospective buyer. That seemed like an easy way for that situation for him to show it without.
I think it just needs to be made clear.
Are we allowed to use that versus like the buyer agency agreement? That's supposedly we're supposed to use. Do we know?
Yeah, I think the purpose of that buyer representation agreement is if you are acting as a buyer, as their fiduciary agent, then they need to sign that. But if you're not acting in that capacity and you've made it clear, then that's a different situation. But the point of all this is that you need to know who you're representing and you need to represent them. And the agent that I quoted a minute ago, she's an award-winning broker with a major real estate brokerage. And this is what she said publicly. She's basically publicly stated that I don't care what agency law says. I don't care who my fiduciary is. This is what I'm going to do. And it's a problem. The point of these changes is to have a very clear separation between a selling agent and a buyer's agent. You are not allowed to post a cooperating commission anywhere for any reason. Okay. If you find a clever way around this, as a lot of people have said that they're going to do, it's a matter of time before you get in a lot of trouble.
Grant, I'm going to jump in. According to the NAR settlement, the only manner in which you can post a buyer agent compensation is if it is a public facing format, meaning if it's on your business Facebook page and you don't have to enter a sign up wall, if it is posted on a real estate sign, if it is mailed out in flyers, if it's an ad in a newspaper, if it's a commercial on television. What cannot happen is for us locally, our North Shore Realtor Facebook groups or our St. Tammany Facebook groups that are only members of the agent community, we cannot discuss any compensation.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you. I'm sure Kelly's correct on that, but I know that there's been talk about whether or not that should be allowed because the purpose of that is they're trying to get rid of steering. I know a lot of people say, well, steering is a specific term that only applies to a protected class. It doesn't. Steering involves steering your client to buy a certain house for a reason that might not be in their best interest. For example, D.R. Horton sends me a text message that we're paying 5% commission to agents that bring us an offer on this house. If you start ringing your client off the hook to try to get them out of this contract so they can buy this other house that pays you more money, that is steering. And the entire purpose of what the DOJ was trying to get rid of was that. The whole issue with clear cooperation and things like that is it basically forced people to pay a certain commission in order for anybody to want to buy their house. Okay, and that's why you're going to see in a second, we are not going to specify for our sellers how much they have to pay to a buyer's agent. We're not going to do that. At our company, we're not. And I don't think it's in their best interest. Okay, but I would not try to find a clever way around.
Yeah,
Yes, Steven. I don't think he meant to talk. So anyways, another issue. All documents, in my opinion, should be as short and as simple as possible. Okay, they should be easy to read. For those of you who are local, if you attended a certain class, you'll realize that a certain real estate coach kind of called out Kelly and some of us for having a one-page document for a buyer rep agreement. And they said, oh, it needs to be at least 6 pages. It needs to cover all these bases. Okay, they said we were crazy for having a one-page document. About 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice opened up a formal inquiry against a California realtor board because they had a 6-page long document that was impossible to read.
Yeah.
All right. The purpose of these documents is not to protect you and your brokerage from your client. The purpose of these documents is to explain your fiduciary relationship to your client, what they should expect from you, and what fees that would be. That is the purpose of these documents. I think too many brokers will hire a team of attorneys and have them draft a big long document to protect them from the client. It's not what these documents are here for. They should be readable by everybody. It shouldn't take a team of attorneys to understand a buyer rep agreement. What's up, Jack? You got to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Okay. Okay. So let me share this slide. I'm going to throw up something. We're going to start with the buyer rep agreement. Okay. I'm going to share a link for that right now. I'm going to put it in chat. So anybody who wants to pull this up is welcome to do so. Let me make sure this is the right link. Yep. Okay. So this is the buyer rep agreement that we are going to suggest all of our people use at 1% list. Obviously, our brokers are going to make the final call, but this is the one that we've created. So if anybody wants to open that up and click on that link, you're more than welcome to. We're going to go with that first. Okay. So number one, you need to have one of these signed before you go show client properties. Okay. Notice I said client. If they are unrepresented, they do not want to hire you, whatever else, that puts you in a much different situation. But if this person is going to be your client, if you are going to be their fiduciary, or if they're going to be your fiduciary, they need to sign this. All commissions are negotiable, must be in that. Okay. A start date and an expiration date of the buyer rep agreement must be in there. A set amount that you are charging must be a set percentage of like the gross sales price or a set flat fee based on whatever. It may not be open-ended. It might not, like you can't say somewhere between 2.5% and 5%. You have to have a number, okay? Or a set percentage. That's the only thing that will fly.
It has to be an ascertainable amount, and it can be any variation. According to NAR, it could be a percentage, it could be a flat fee, or it could be an hourly rate. Whatever the case that you elect to use, you have to make sure that the client understands how that amount is being arrived to. So if you're doing an hourly rate, you need to explicitly explain what is going to constitute the start of that charge.
Correct.
I don't think a majority of agents are going to go the hourly rate format.
So in a lot of ways, what I would do, like if you have a listing and somebody calls you and they say they're unrepresented, I would have that conversation, let them know. So Scott asked the question, somebody wants to see a house tonight, they're not working with an agent, they won't sign something over the phone. I get it. What I would do, I would bring an agency agreement, like an agency disclosure, which is what you're required to bring anyways to make them understand that you are in fact a realtor, real estate agent that they're meeting with. And then I would bring an exclusive buyer representation agreement and I would present it to them and I would have that conversation with them. If they say, look, we're not signing that, I would just write down on there, unwilling to sign, but you're opening the door for your seller, because at the end of the day, you have to represent your seller. Okay, if they are a potential buyer of that home, even if they're unrepresented, your seller hired you to sell their house. That's what you're there to do. Okay. So you cannot make more than the amount set forth in that document without specifically amending the document. Stacia, you got a question?
Are you able to share your screen while you're going over it or no?
Yeah, I can do that.
Might help other people like looking at it at the same time.
Okay, I shared the link so people can see it, but I can do that. Can everybody see this? Everybody see that? You want to ask some questions? We'll answer some questions really quick. Stephen Young, what you got? Then Landon and James and Jack, what you got, Stephen?
Hey, yeah, so I'm just curious. You know, I understand like we can't have this buyer agency agreement be open-ended in terms of compensation. What I am curious about is, you know, I feel like for most of my local clients, you know, I probably would think like the amount would be pretty standard. But, you know, for instance, like on a lot of relocation clients that are coming into the area, generally I've found that timeline, the amount of work that goes into that, you know, like remote showings and virtual tours, in addition to them maybe flying out 2 to 3 times to look at, you know, houses for 3 days straight. I just found that generally these relocation clients it's more workload, to be honest. And so, you know, is there something that can this be structured differently depending on the client? You know, would this be like, you know, my agreement with local clients might be 2%, and for relo clients, it might be 3%. That's fine as long as it's in writing.
Absolutely, man. Look, not only can it, I think it should. And I think what needs to happen is I think it needs to be a very open and honest conversation. Like the one thing that I've found that people respond well to is honesty. Okay, it's when they feel like things are unspoken or hidden or whatever else that people respond in a weird sort of way. Like, here's the thing: we've sold houses before for people, and I know they're going to buy a tract builder's home. Like I know they're going to buy a builder's house. That builder is not going to negotiate price at all because they're building 1,000 houses in this neighborhood, and the builder always pays this. Okay, I look at that builder very different than a certain other family which I showed houses to for 2 years. Like I had this lovely couple, and she had an allergy issue, and she walked into numerous houses which she described as absolutely perfect, but if they have potpourri and Glade plugins throughout the house, it gets in the walls and she can't stand it. Those people I worked with since like 2022, 2021. So yeah, I would obviously treat those people differently. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But one of the things that Louisiana wanted in there was explain your scope of work. Okay, so here's the thing: if you have somebody sign one of these at whatever fee, and then they find out afterwards, oh, sorry, I shut it down at 4:30 Monday through Friday, and I don't work weekends, they might feel a certain way about having signed this with you. So, you know, managing expectations is best practices for anybody in any profession ever. You know, so totally agree. Landon, what you got?
Going back to the question you had just beforehand, or what you said about the showing, like that scenario you just said, I'm selling a house, buyer's not signing this, they're refusing. Are we still, I mean, from what you're saying, we're still allowed to show the home, even though they're not signing a buyer agency agreement. Like my understanding is you're not showing a home unless they sign something. And I know we have a fiduciary to the seller, but at the same time, like this is where confusion is. Like, how, you know, navigate that water. How does that look?
I would make it incredibly clear to them that you're going to present this document to them. If they don't sign it, then that's understandable. However, you're going to make it clear to them that you are solely opening the door for them, and your strict fiduciary responsibilities to your seller. And I would get them to respond to that saying, I understand. And
but are we allowed to? That's the question. Are we allowed to through this DOJ thing that's happening? Like, is it allowed?
I don't see how you wouldn't be. But here's the thing. Like, if you're not allowed to do that in that scenario, then I think there's so many sellers that are going to get treated very poorly, because now we're turning away ready, willing, and able buyers. When we're in an interest rate environment at 7%, and you know groceries are $450 a trip and everything else, if you got a buyer for a house, they better damn well see the house. We've got people who are desperate to sell. And so, I mean, here's the thing. If I'm going to get hauled in for that, and this is one of those gray areas that probably just needs to have a little bit more clarification. But if I'm going to get hauled in for doing my fiduciary responsibility to my seller, especially when it's been made abundantly clear I'm not representing them, I'm opening a door and they responded, yes, they understand, then I guess I'll deal with what I got to deal with. But I mean, at the end of the day, at my core, I'm going to take care of my client. And if my client's a seller, I'm going to do what's in their best interest. And whatever happens, happens. Malaya, you have a question? I hope I'm not butchering your name.
Hey, you were close. So I saw, like Lindsay said, if the buyer rep agreement allows for a 2% commission and the seller is offering 2.5, are we allowed to receive the 2.5? Kelly said you can only accept the max amount that's on the buyer rep agreement. What's the flip side of that? Let's say hypothetically, we have 2.5 on the agreement and the seller's offering, let's say 1.5, just for an example. Do we then have to amend the rep agreement, or can we take lower?
Yes. Yeah, I would literally, that's the next thing on my bullet point that I was about to talk about. You cannot make more than the amount set forth in the document without specifically amending the document. I would not terminate your buyer rep agreement if a property comes along that's paying you more. Okay, so if you have them signed up at 2% and they wind up going with a builder property or whoever else and they're paying 3%, okay, then you're basically forced with this. You can have a conversation with your buyer and say, look, they're offering to pay more. Are you okay if I accept more? If so, then you amend. You use a simple amendment document. You reference the document you're amending. Okay, so you would just have a very simple amendment and you say, the purpose of this is to amend the buyer rep agreement signed on this date between this party and myself or my brokerage for this property location only. Purchaser has agreed to allow buyer's agent commission to be 3% instead of 2% or whatever else it is. But they have to agree to that in writing. Another thing you can do is you can basically give it to them in concessions. But if you're going to take more, then they have to sign off on it. They have to understand that before you do it. Okay.
But what about less though?
If it's less, then what I would tell them is you've got 2 choices. You can either say, look, you're going to owe me the difference, or you can do that same single property amendment and say that you're agreeing to take less on this property.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Grant, I've
yes.
got a quick question, and it has to do with the issue of when you are listing a house and you have it open and you have a number of people that want to see it and they're want to walk through the door and look at it. Are you going to prepare something for that specific situation?
No.
Okay, so Jeff, let me hop in here, Grant.
Yep.
If you are hosting an open house, it is open to the public, and therefore you do not need a buyer representation agreement from any prospective buyers that are just meandering through the home.
Yep.
If you go in the chat, Jeff, there's a link that I posted. Look for the 1022 timestamp, and you can open that link, and that goes to facts regarding the NAR settlement, and it actually specifically answered that question.
All right, well, that's good to know.
Finally, just to piggyback on the other one, you cannot receive compensation from any other source that exceeds the amount in this agreement. Okay, so if a title company, lender, or anybody else is giving out bonuses for anything else, you cannot make more than is stated. So for example, practical scenario here, and I'm not talking about the legality of any of these things, but if the seller is offering 2%, your buyer rep agreement says 2.5%, and you have a lender that's gonna, or whatever, that's somebody else that's gonna offer you another 0.5% for bringing that buyer, you can accept it because you've got 2% to 2.5%. But if they're offering 1%, you cannot accept up to 3% because you're capped at 2.5%. Okay, so there cannot be, that might be a horrible analogy, but the point is you cannot accept more than what you have stated from any source at all. Okay, we had a couple more questions. I got James first. What you got, James?
All right, so if we're showing houses to unrepresented buyers and benefit of our sellers, are we able to qualify those buyers to make sure they're actual legitimate, qualified, bona fide, able to purchase? I mean, if we have them sign that self-represented form, can we ask for a pre-approval before we open that door?
Absolutely.
I mean, how do we know that they're legit if we can't ask for that? And
Yeah.
I mean, at what point is that, I mean, as far as I know, isn't that considered, what is it, a significant act,
No.
by asking for pre-approval? How much are you approved for, FHA, conventional? I mean, all of that stuff is basically
say that is.
determines a client, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that is, because I've asked a million other agents about their clients. I mean, here's the thing. I don't think you're required to waste your time on behalf of your seller, but I would say if you have a buyer who insists on being unrepresented. Okay, I went through one of these recently, one of these ministerial act situations recently. I opened the door. I allowed them to enter. They were self-represented. We made it clear, and I'll talk in a little bit about how to do that. But we made it incredibly clear, how that's done. Best practices: you should disclose what sort of services you're providing for your buyer. They need to have a clear understanding of the level of service for the price quoted. For example, if you are 24/7 at their beck and call and you want to charge 4%, God bless you. If you've got somebody running around looking at tract builder homes and you want to only charge 1%, but you're like, look, all I'm doing is drawing up the offer, that's fine too. I don't think it matters which one you are. The important thing is that your client understands what to expect from you and sees value accordingly. Okay. As long as expectations are fully explained and an amount is set for that, I don't think anybody has a problem. It's when there's a gray area there's an issue. Jack, you had a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And you may have answered this earlier, but I was a couple minutes late. Who dictates the buyer's commission? Is that us? Is that the seller? It sounds like from everything else you're answering that it's us through negotiating with the buyer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in just a minute, and we're going to give you specific verbiage for that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So you should another best practice, you should ask your buyer if they want to pay for your services or have a seller pay for them. Okay. Pretty much, I'm sure almost all of them are going to say they would prefer the seller to pay for your services. Okay. I would encourage everybody here to write this down, because this is the terminology that we think you should be using. Once again, if you don't work for us or anything else, talk to your broker. Okay. This is what we would recommend. Purchasers request sellers to compensate purchaser's agent in the amount of X due at closing / act of sale. So if you want to write something down from this meeting, it's that. Purchasers request seller to compensate purchaser's agent in the amount of X, either a percentage of gross sales price or flat fee, due at closing / act of sale.
And that verbiage came from my conversations with, I'll send that out to you, Mary. That verbiage came from my conversations specifically with Charlie Lee, who is NAR legal counsel, as well as Kim Calloway, who is Louisiana Realtors legal counsel.
Yep. So that way it's being incredibly clearly laid out that your purchaser is requesting them to pay you. Okay. Anybody got any questions of that? Now then, Jack was asking, how do we determine? Well, that X number, okay, purchaser's agent in the amount of X, that should be what's in your agreement. Okay, and we're going to get into that because we condensed down our listing agreement and other things as well. But one of the things that we are doing with our sellers is, obviously, we're no longer, and we've never told them, but we're definitely not telling them, hey, you have to pay a co-op. We've never believed that. Now, almost all of our clients do, but we've never said you have to do this. Okay, but beyond that, literally, it's going to be simply a question of, Are you going to agree to compensate a buyer's agent? Yes or no? Period. Okay. And when they say yes or no in writing in your listing agreement, then you can compensate accordingly. Okay. But when, like, let's say Chloe wants to write an offer on one of my properties, and Chloe calls and Chloe's like, are you compensating a buyer's agent? And we say yes. And then she says, well, how much? I'm going to say, I don't know, Chloe. How much do you want? Why don't you put that in your offer? How am I supposed to know what your agreement says with your buyer? You might have agreed to $500. You might want 5%. I don't know. Write it in the offer. But that's the purpose of the buyer rep agreement, is to establish that number between you and your buyer, and that's what you should request. Okay. Anybody got any question on that?
Grant, I have a question.
Please.
So, we're not allowed to accept compensation over the amount that's in this buyer representation form. If we're putting the compensation in the offer, it needs to be the same compensation that's in this representation agreement, because the only thing that I'm anticipating is that a buyer is going to say, well, I don't want to pay you. Can we just put the compensation in the offers? And so if we were to put, 2.5%, 3% or whatever in this representation agreement, they kind of are assuming that risk if the seller disagrees to pay our compensation. Does that make sense?
I think I get what you're saying. Basically, I think that can happen.
Yeah, that's what I'm anticipating, that, they're going to want to put 0 in this form, put it in the offers, but then we can't ask for 2.5%.
So yeah, well, so here's the thing. I mean, you could, I totally get what you're saying. And here's what, and I go back to that agent that I was talking, or that broker earlier, unfortunately, that I was talking about earlier. And she was saying, well, the problem is nobody's, displaying their value clear enough. Before this meeting, I called one of the biggest local lenders. And I asked her, I said, of all the loans you do, how many of them can afford to write their client a check, or write their agent a check for 2.5% at closing? She said almost none. And so effectively what we're doing here, and this is the sad part of all this, is we're having a buyer sign up to agree to pay us. If the seller refuses to compensate us, they're going to be liable for it, and they're not going to have the money.
Exactly.
And I've had and look, you're an attorney, right?
Yes.
I've had a lot of agents say, like, in this meeting that we were all at, one of them said, oh, we're just going to sue our clients. Sue them for what? First of all, if you want to run your business in the ground, start suing your clients. But second of all, if they don't have 2.5% to pay you at a closing, what are you going to sue them for?
Right.
It's a lot of people who are not thinking outside of their broker or real estate agent hat. They're not putting themselves in the position of their clients. And that's why we're in this predicament to begin with. What's up, April Horn? I'm going April, then Chloe, and then Teresa. And then Danny. What's up, April?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so my thought is, in this little statement where we're saying purchasers to request seller to compensate, I'm thinking it's just like when we ask for closing costs. I always try to explain to my sellers that technically the buyers are just financing their closing costs.
I agree.
So it's the same thing when we start talking about this commission. So if the seller is not wanting to pay the commission and it's coming from the buyer, is there another way we can word it so that the buyer's paying it, but it's still on the contract? Does that make sense?
Nope. No, there's no way to word it.
You have to word it that the seller's paying it, even though.
Yep.
Okay. But you want to put it on the contract regardless, because if not, there's no way to force the buyer to pay you.
So April, if you are in negotiations and you've asked as the buyer rep to have the seller provide compensation to you as a buyer agent, and the seller counters and says, look, we're good with all terms except the compensation, instead of 2% or whatever the ask is, it's 0%. Now you're going to need to go to your buyer and say, okay, here it is. The seller is not willing to offer up this compensation. You and I have this buyer rep agreement signed. You're going to be held liable for this. You can then always say, okay, instead of 3% that was agreed upon on this, we can amend it and make it 2%. But what I would absolutely do in the counter offer, I would counter back to the seller and say, purchaser agrees to seller not offering compensation to buyer agent. However, we are attaching buyer rep agreement to be made a part of the purchase agreement. That way, your title company can see that there is an agreement.
Perfect.
Yeah. So the problem that we're going to run into,
Sorry to interrupt. Are lenders allowing that? Can you finance your BAC on that?
no, I do not believe you can. So the problem that we're running into, and there's a lot of people that haven't quite wrapped their brain around this yet. The buyer rep agreement is an agreement between you and your client. Okay, or more specifically, your brokerage and your client, I should say. A purchase agreement is an agreement between a seller and a buyer. So unless there is verbiage in there requiring you to get paid at closing, they can satisfy, they can close and tell you to kick rocks at a closing. I'm not paying you. And then that's when you have to go after them legally. And I don't see that as being a winning strategy. And so the only way to make sure that you are going to get compensated, number one, have this buyer rep agreement signed, but number two, that verbiage that I shared multiple times in chat, that needs to go in the purchase agreement. Unless your seller or unless your buyer has made it clear, no, I'm writing you a check at the closing. In which case, honestly, I'd probably put that in the purchase agreement. You know, just so it's tied to the closing of the sale that gets done. Bill Newman, I'm going to try to answer a few questions and then move on. Bill Newman, what you got?
Why wouldn't you have this signed before you even show the home? Because if you're going to show them buyer agreement, I got 3%, and they say, okay, we'll go ahead and, you know, depending on the offer, so forth. And if they come back and say, no, we're not going to pay, then it's our responsibility to share that with our buyer agency, you know, agreement with our purchaser and say, listen, they're not going to pay me. Do you want to go ahead and amend this to where you are definitely going to pay me for my services?
Yeah, no, that's definitely best practices. You would just want to get in front of it. Okay. And somebody else just said, what did somebody say? Somebody said, I am not showing a home before talking to a listing agent. I think that's best practices, but I wouldn't even say talking. I would say texting. Send them a text and just say, are you compensating a buyer's agent? And whenever they say yes, like with an acceptable offer, will you pay my compensation agreement? And when they say yes, now you're good. But if they say no, that's when you got to go back and have a conversation with your buyer and say, look, they are not compensating a buyer's agent. Just so you understand, we have this representation agreement in place. What do you want to do?
What?
Okay, we had a couple more people with raised hands. I got Chloe, then Teresa, then Danny, then Steven.
So my thought here was always contact the listing agent before.
I agree. You muted yourself, Chloe. We can't hear you.
So even if I'm having the conversation with that listing agent, I'm going to push for it to be over text or email. And before I'm going to notify my client that this buyer agency agreement is needed, but I'm going to show them in writing what the listing agent has stated the seller is willing to offer for commission and put that amount on my buyer agency agreement. And so that the buyer feels comfortable signing it. Unless, of course, it's, you know, something where they say, you know, that you wouldn't be comfortable. But at this point, I feel like if you just do a lot of the legwork on the forehand, fully explaining them, showing them in writing, hey, this listing is paying me 2.5%. That's what I'm going to put on this buyer agency agreement. And if something changes in negotiations and they lower it to 2, okay, so be it. We'll amend the agreement. But I personally, I'm not super scared of this. I think if you do the legwork up front, and on the other side, I do think if we start saying, the commission is negotiable, write it in the contract, more people are going to move to that because it's helping your sellers. But
Well,
But Chloe, give me 1 second, Kelly. Here's my thing, Chloe. If I have a property listed and you call me and you say, are you compensating a buyer's agent? Then I would obviously answer in whichever way my seller told me to answer. But then when you say how much, I'm going to tell you that's up to you. Put in the offer.
right. Do you think
it's not up to me.
right?
So in being a fiduciary for the seller, the way I would look at it with representing a seller, are you willing to offer compensation to a buyer agent? I still think a high majority of sellers are going to say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they don't, they're immediately shooting themselves in their foot with first-time home buyers,
Yep.
with even resale home buyers that are having to move in for jobs or move, like whatever the case may be. Most people do not have $10,000 to spare to cover closing, to cover compensation, right? In order to be a fiduciary for the seller, I don't want to pigeonhole them and say, okay, we think you should offer 2% or 3% or 2.5% to the buyer's agent, because if we pigeonhole them to that and write that amount into this agreement, and they're giving you permission to tell buyer's agents we're offering 2.5%, that gives that buyer agent an opportunity to go back and create a new buyer rep agreement specific to that property that has a written amount of 2.5% in it. When initially they might have been under contract with a buyer rep agreement at 2% or 1.5%. So the way that I would kind of spin it to my client as the seller, let's see what they are in a contract for. They are going to tell us that in the purchase agreement, at which point you as the seller, you might be listed at $100,000. You might get an offer for $115,000 and they're asking for 3%. Well, at the end of the day, the only thing your seller is concerned with is the bottom line.
Yep.
So long as the house appraises, I'll give you 5%, as long as my bottom line is what I'm looking to get out of it, out of this sale.
Correct. I would completely agree with Kelly, and this becomes even more of a problem at higher price points. Because sometimes you get in higher price points, you got somebody selling a $2 million property, and they're like, I'm not paying 3%. Are you nuts? But here's the thing, when you educate, it sounds awful the way I'm going to say this, but when you educate your seller and be like, look, all that matters is your bottom line. That's it. Chloe, if I was in a $400,000 house, you brought me a cash buyer for $500,000 and you wanted $60,000, girl, I will pay you 60 grand fast and high five you on your way out the door. Okay. All that I care about is my bottom line as a seller. And the pain in the butt sellers, just speaking honestly, are the ones that are trying to figure out all the things that don't matter. If you get them on a railroad one-track mind of what's my closing date, what am I netting? When you get them thinking like that, they become so much easier to deal with than when they're worried about, all these other things that don't matter. So you, as a buyer's agent, you set your commission. You write it in the offer. Okay. Now you're not going to have to worry about showing houses anymore, where some listing agent signed up somebody for 6% and they're paying you 1.5%. Those days are over with. Okay. Which is a good thing. I got Danny, then Teresa, then Stephen.
Hey, I kind of forgot, man. So much is going to my head right now. Okay, what about, I mean, you probably already addressed this, but the D.R. Hortons that are offering like 6%, to the buyer's agent, is that going away as well? How do we,
Nope.
Okay, how does that work?
You get an amendment for a specific property to your buyer rep agreement.
So if
Okay,
you
so
know,
in other words,
you're going to show them those houses, I would have a buyer rep agreement for that subdivision, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So if they're looking in that subdivision and you sold so many homes with them, and that now you're at the 6%, or if there's specials, how all agents get texts saying, hey, show houses in this subdivision, we're offering 5% commission.
Yep.
I would have a buyer rep agreement that's strictly for that subdivision, right? And then if they decide to buy in there, you're covered. If they're looking in there and they're not happy, then they want to go outside of that subdivision where they're obviously not going to offer 5-6% compensation off the bat. I would redo a buyer rep agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and one more thing. You mentioned something of, I don't know if this is going away as well, but I know that at some point, if a house is really difficult to sell, the seller will offer $1,000 buyer's bonus. That is going away, is what you're saying. You cannot really accept that anymore.
You can't accept it. I mean, they could put it. I mean, you shouldn't put it out there as a listing as a seller, and because they can't accept it.
So here's the thing: you can
offer closing costs, or offer renovation allowance, or offer interest rate reduction, something like that.
Okay.
Teresa, what you got? Teresa, you still got a question?
Yeah, I think it's mostly been answered. I had put it in the chat, but so if I have a buyer agent agreement signed with my client and we talk about the 3%, I'm like, worst case scenario, 3%. But to make our offer more attractive to a seller, that I know is, I call the listing agent, I say, are y'all offering a commission? Yes. We put in our offer. Maybe I know that there are other offers coming. To make our offer more attractive, let's say I can ask for 1% from the seller and then talk to my buyer and say, you'll be responsible for the other 2% if they're okay with that. Is that okay to write it like that?
You can do that all day long.
That is
you don't
okay.
have to change a single thing. You can do that all day long, and you don't have to change anything.
Okay. I think it's really important for people, even as a buyer's agent, to understand what the houses are worth that they're going to see, because there have been many a time that we have over offered knowing I know what the appraisal might come in at. And so to keep their out-of-pocket costs down, we have offered many times over list price and basically padded the loan.
Yep.
So, I guess my advice would be to continue to do that for your compensation as well, and just try to know what your numbers are.
Totally agree. Steven, what you got?
Hey, so in Arkansas, on the buyer side, none of the agent commissions are shown on the HUD on the settlement statement, which makes sense. But now with this change, are we going to basically be sending this buyer agency agreement to the title company?
No.
And it's going to really?
No, because it should be in the offer.
Okay.
Yeah. So remember that verbiage that we had earlier? I'll scroll up and find it and reshare it, but the verbiage: purchasers request seller to compensate purchaser's agent in the amount of whatever due at closing act of sale. So that should be, I mean, realistically, nobody should ever see your buyer rep agreement except for you and your buyer and your broker, unless.
So in the instance that you're under contract with your buyer at 3% and you end up requesting 2% from the seller because, to like Teresa said, to be competitive, maybe that additional 1% that you're under contract with the buyer for, that's going to be on them, and that would show up on their HUD, right?
Nope.
Where would that show up?
They wouldn't show up anywhere. They're responsible for paying you.
I would say you can still
outside
put
of
the
closing?
buyer.
Yep.
I would say that you could still add it to the contract. Buyer agrees to pay 1% compensation towards buyer brokerage in the actual contract.
Yeah, you can. And I think that's best practices for sure, Stacia, because now you're making it one of the pillars of the contract to make sure you get paid. But going beyond that, there's not, to my knowledge, any mechanism to make sure that's in a closing disclosure or a HUD or anything else. Like, there's no mechanism for that. So it's not going to show up there. It's just going to be part of
Wouldn't we want it to be so that it shows on the settlement statement that buyer, this is what you're bringing to closing, the down payment, lender fees, plus my commission? Because I wouldn't want to mess with that outside of closing.
Yeah, you'd probably want it to be, but really best practices are just make sure you have it in writing, where you send an email or a text to your client saying, hey, just so you know, this is the scenario. But yeah, I mean, there's not currently a mechanism where it's going to be in the closing disclosure that I know of, or the HUD.
Because my concern would be
a little bit more Wild West, considering it's cash and you can have whatever in a HUD.
Yeah, well, because I mean, I would feel more comfortable if it's like, hey, buyer, like, to close on this, these are all of your fees, including mine, and I get paid at closing, just like on a transactions how they've been to date. So, anyways, just a thought. I mean, I know there's a lot.
I think we'd all feel better if it was that way, but it's not.
Yeah.
Like that's probably going to be gone. What you got, Mary Skinner?
So I'm going to back this whole conversation up a little bit because we're talking about getting to closing. And I think for me personally, I don't even know that we're going to get to the end of the house because I can't imagine that any buyer is going to sign this form. Consequently, I can't show them the house that they want to see. If that's the case, they say, no, Mary, I'm not going to sign anything. And I say, okay, well, what do I say to them? You're on your own. Call the listing agent. What verbiage is everybody going to use? We're jumping to closing. You haven't even got them in the door yet. If they don't sign this agreement.
I've talked to a lot of people who said that they would not sign this.
And I don't blame them. I got to be honest. If I was on, the shoe was on the other foot and I wasn't a realtor, I wouldn't sign it either.
Look, I've talked to a lot of people who said they wouldn't sign it. Once again.
So what is your response to that? When my $1 million buyer comes back to Florida next week and I say, Don, now you have to sign this form and tell me how much you're going to pay me. And he says, oh, I'm not going to pay anything.
Well,
so
shout out to you guys. You guys are uncanny because every question that you ask is literally what I have set to talk about next.
Okay.
So literally, this is what I have. Go ahead, Kelly.
The playing field is level. It's not that one brokerage is mandating the use of this buyer rep agreement.
Right.
It's now every single brokerage effective August 17th is going to have the same response. I would love to show you 123 Main Street. However, legally, in order for me to do that, I need to have you sign this buyer rep agreement. Now, the buyer rep agreement can be good for one house, one showing. It can expire in an hour. It can expire at the end of today at 11:59 p.m. It can be good for 2 days. However long you want that buyer rep agreement good for, that's how long it would be good for. But if you're having a conversation with your buyer, Mary, and your buyer says, no, I'm not signing it unless it has zero commission, you need to then have a conversation explaining how that's going to work. Look, I understand you don't want to put a dollar amount down or a percentage amount, but you're going to have the same conversation with another buyer agent that you're going to call. Legally, we cannot show you a property without this being signed. And then not only do we need this signed to protect you as the buyer, so you know what you're getting of my services, but I need that to protect me as well.
Yep. Stephen asked an interesting question in chat. So here's what I put together if somebody refused to sign. Number one, you don't show them the house. Number two, explain why it's important to have your own representation. Okay. And I don't think that's a hard explanation to give. Okay. But explain why it's important to have your own representation. Offer a slightly reduced rate. Offer a reduced timeline to build trust. So like, here's a perfect example. Jeff, if somebody's coming into town, they want to see houses in Money Hill, they reached out to you. That's correct, Stephen Young. They're going to write it out to your broker because you can't be paid directly. They have to write it out to your broker, and so that's how it's going to work. So Jeff, if somebody's coming into Money Hill, they don't want to sign this document, and you tell them, look, how about this? You have to sign it in order for me to show you houses, but I'm going to have a one-day buyer rep agreement. It's going to go into effect on Saturday. It's going to expire on Sunday morning. So I'm going to put in there, 1% or 0% or whatever it is. But I think once you meet me and spend time with me and understand my knowledge of the neighborhood and everything that's going on, I think you're going to feel comfortable hiring me. I think that's a reasonable thing to say to somebody. I think people who go in, I think the ones that are going to get in trouble are going to be the ones that simply slide it in front of their face and say, oh, by the way, you need to sign this. Which is why they're cracking down on people that are writing documents that are impossible to understand and impossibly long documents. Because let's be honest, nobody's going to sit there and read a 6-page buyer rep agreement, just like nobody's going to read the new terms and conditions for using your iPhone. All right. And so if you keep presenting people with that, it's a matter of time before you get in trouble. So just look, It starts today and it ends tomorrow. Okay. It's going to say 2% on it. It starts today and ends tomorrow. If you don't like me, you don't have to use me, but I think you're going to like me after meeting with me and spending time with me. That's how you're going to get people to sign this. Okay. You're going to want to extend it after you meet me and spend time with me, because you're going to understand how useful I am. Okay. But that's going to have to be how a lot of people approach it. Because look, I've talked to a lot of people off the record. I'm talking about people who are responsible for making agents happy. And I asked them, said, if you got to move to Colorado tomorrow, are you going to sign one of those with an agent? They tell me, hell no, I'm not signing that. But if I ask them, would you sign one of those with me? And they're like, yeah, I'd sign it with you. I trust you. I like you. So that's where it is. You have to build that level of trust. Okay. Noah had a question.
Thanks, Grant. One of the things that, I've talked to a lot of my peers and other brokers in the area, and in a lot of past clients that I have great rapport with, and they say, what's going on with all this National Association of Realtors lawsuit stuff? And I say, well, we're figuring it out. The truth about all these changes is it's going to create a lot of chaos in the short term, and things are going to get worse before they get better. But I 100% agree that these changes that have been made are in the best interest of the consumer. Because to Grant's point, everybody's asked this question and raised their hand. Well, what do we do if we can't get this buyer to sign? Or what do we do if I'm not going to get paid? Again, that's backwards thinking. That's not putting the interest of the consumer before your own. Just like Grant's point, if you've got somebody that's coming in for a turn and burn weekend and wants to see a few houses, explain to them up front, look, I am now required to have a brokerage agreement with you. It can be exclusive. It can be non-exclusive. You can offer to compensate me, or if I want to get compensated, this is it. But why don't we do this? Here's my, and in Georgia, we have an agreement to work with a buyer as a customer. It's basically a ministerial act agreement. I'm sure you've heard Grant say that a lot. And all of these agents who have been, poo-pooing or discounting, the discount agent model and saying, know your worth. Well, that's exactly what all of these agents are now going to have to prove and provide is their worth to prospective buyer clients. Build a rapport with them. Anytime I always got exclusive buyer agency agreement signed, which I always had, I said, hey, look, here's our exclusive buyer agency agreement. This is what I expect to get paid. I'm going to do everything I can to make the seller pay it. If I can't, then know that you're going to have to pay me X dollars for my services. And also, by the way, here is our unilateral termination of our brokerage agreement. I've already signed it. If for whatever reason, at any point in us working together, you don't feel like I have your best interest at heart, you want to work with someone else, I don't care, even without cost. I've already signed this as the broker. All you have to do is sign it and send it back to me. You can hire me and fire me right away. And that's worked incredibly. Like, okay, I have to make a commitment to you, but I don't want a commitment without a way out. What if you suck? What if you don't know the neighborhood? What if you don't have my best interest at heart? Well, don't worry. I've already signed the document that fires me, and I'm okay with it. You've got both of them right now. You want to go look at houses? Let's go look at houses. I want to make sure you get what you want. We'll worry about how I get paid later. And that's always worked out for me. So yeah, it's going to be confusing and it's going to suck in the short term. But the mandatory buyer rep agreements, I think, are a huge benefit to quality fiduciary driven agents, and just use them to your benefit.
Yep. Look, I totally get it. I totally agree, Noah. And there's an interesting conversation going on in chat right now. But look, I think this is the last thing we got to say on the buyer rep agreement. The buyer rep agreement, and we've asked numerous people this, okay? Everything from legal counsel for like the national body of NAR to on down the line, we asked them, we said, let's say that we sign a buyer rep agreement with our buyer. And they said, okay. And I said, but a seller refuses to compensate us. And they say, yeah. And I said, so we get to the closing. What happens? They said the closing is going to take place no matter what. And I said, okay, then what? And they said, it's your responsibility to get paid by your buyer. It's not a part of the closing disclosure. It's not required in that contract. You're not going to put all parties in default on the purchase of a property because a buyer thought that the seller was going to pay the buyer's agent and then the seller refused to, and now the buyer doesn't want to pay their buyer's agent. You are not going to put all parties in a contract in default because of that. You're not going to halt a sale. A lender is not going to lose a deal. A title company is not going to lose a deal. And both the buyer and seller are not going to be in default of a purchase agreement because the seller refused to pay you, because the buyer's agent is responsible for getting paid by their buyer unless it's specifically stated otherwise in the purchase agreement. Okay. And we've had an agent that keeps writing us these offers that says, in order to satisfy my agreement with my buyer, the seller is to pay this. Okay. And the reason I don't like that wording is because if I sent a counterback that says, well, in order to satisfy the listing agreement with the seller and the listing agent, the buyer is to pay this. The buyer would be like, what the hell am I doing that for? Okay. It's important to understand these things. I am not currently aware of any mechanism that's going to take an agreement between a buyer and the buyer's agent and force that into the closing documents if it's not a part of the contract at all. I'm just not aware of that. Got two questions. Then we're moving on to something that is listing agreement as well as the rider to our listing agreement, which I think everybody will find pretty interesting. What you got, Holly? Can't hear anything, Holly. Go ahead.
Can't hear me?
Got you now.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So I'm trying to keep up with the chat and what's going on the screen. So I just have a couple of questions. Taking it back to the listing agreement. So do I understand correctly that we're no longer going to negotiate an exact percentage in the listing agreement to compensate the buyer's agent? It's only going to be yes or no question.
Once again, y'all ask a question right before I answer in this, but yes, you're absolutely correct. That's not
Okay.
what we're doing.
Okay, and then number two, so I didn't get the gentleman's name that was saying, I really liked what he said about, hey, here's the buyer rep agreement and here's the cancellation of it.
That's Noah.
So
Noah owns one of our offices in South Carolina and Georgia. He's awesome.
So can we tell the buyer then, hey, I know you don't want to sign this, because a buyer who is adamant on, I want the seller to pay commission, because I think that most sellers are going to still offer to pay commission. So that's where I'm expecting to get paid. And the buyer says, well, you have to get paid from them, or I'm not going to be willing to pay you. So we have a buyer rep agreement that says you're willing to pay me 2%, 2.5%, whatever. But here's the cancellation of it. If the seller says they're not going to pay, you can cancel, and then I don't have to represent you. And could we somehow work in that maybe we could, the buyer is okay with it, refer them to the listing agent because they still want to buy the house, and we get a referral fee?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely possible. I think anything's possible. And look, I think everybody's going to have their own policies on this. I attended a class where the coach of that class said, oh, we're going to sue our clients. And all the agents in the room, some of them were like, ugh, and some of them were like, oh yeah, we're going to sue our clients. And like, look, I think you got some brokers that are going to be bulldogs. Okay, they're going to be mean pit bulls. They're going to say, oh, well, the seller's not going to pay me, and you signed this, and you can't afford to pay me. You better get ready. You're about to get a demand letter.
I'm not going to sue any clients. That's out of the question for me.
Well, no, you would anyways. You would have to convince people to do it.
I'm not gonna also go show 10,000 houses to a buyer I don't trust and know that they were gonna pay me if I couldn't get paid. But if I'm just going to show 1 or 2 houses to somebody I don't know, I'm almost okay with saying, okay, you have to sign this saying you're gonna pay me. But if I can't get it out of the listing agency, I'll step away, and it's my loss and my time.
Completely agree.
We
I
do
just shared
that all the time anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just shared a brand new link in chat, which you guys should take a second and open. So we redid the listing agreement to make it a 1-page document. We don't need to go through that right now. Basically, the only thing worth noting in the listing agreement is we have removed any mention of compensation to a cooperating broker. You will not find that anywhere in our listing agreement. Okay. And what we've created is a rider to the listing agreement, which I just shared you guys a link to. So if you want to take a second and open it up, this will clear up basically how we are going to handle this and how I would recommend others to do it, but that's me. So you can either open it up, or I'm going to share my screen right now. But some of these things are required to be in there, like number 1, bold print. all commissions fees are negotiable. You're not required to compensate a cooperating buyer's agent broker. There is no set standard or compensation or fee. That's at the very top. Okay. And so there's a couple scenarios that are going to wind up happening often. Number one, the most common one, in most cases, let me make this a little bit bigger. In most cases, a different cooperating broker. Notice this doesn't sound like lawyer speak, by the way. All right. In most cases, a different / cooperating broker will find the buyer for a listed property. In such cases, a buyer's agent / broker will submit an offer to the listing agent / broker to present to their client. In those cases, a buyer's agent / broker may request as part of the contract for an owner to compensate them by paying a buyer's agent broker commission, which is due at the time of closing. This is in addition to the listing agent's broker's fee. With an acceptable offer, do you agree to allow your listing agent broker to disclose that you are willing to compensate a buyer's agent broker? Yes, you choose to compensate. No, you choose not to. Pretty simple. It's not a set fee. Yeah, you choose to. No, you don't. Okay. So that's going to be the most common. One that people are not common with, but I just went through, Jeff knows this well. I just went through this. Ministerial acts. One of these happened in Money Hill. On occasion, a buyer may insist on being unrepresented by any licensed agent when purchasing a property. In such an instance, ministerial acts may become necessary to be performed by the listing agent / broker to ensure deadlines are met and the process towards closing continues efficiently. During this time, your listing agent broker shall continue to only represent you. Some ministerial acts may include, but are not limited to, scheduling and accompanying an inspector, appraiser, etc. to visit the property, document preparation, relaying factual information. So what can you do when acting in ministerial acts? You can say, okay, unrepresented buyer, what would you like to offer? And if they ask you, well, what do you think they'll take? What do you think we should do? What does the market say it's worth? I'm sorry, I don't represent you. What would you like to offer? That's it. You're not representing them. You're not advising them. You're not acting on their behalf at all. You're simply filling out paperwork. And the reason you're doing this is just like I read earlier, your job is to get your house sold for your seller. And your job is to not tell somebody to go kick rocks, even though they might have an amazing offer for your seller, just because you're not getting paid for it or somebody else is not bringing you the right offer or anything else. Does anybody got any questions on that?
Yeah, I have a question.
What you got, Mon?
So since this is all negotiable, and there's going to be a portion of the contract now that allows sellers to deny compensation to the buyer agent, I mean, negotiation doesn't go one way, it goes both ways. So
Yep.
if they're not willing to compensate a buyer agent, can we just turn down the listing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can fire them. You can turn down the listing. I can tell you what we're going to have in there is right after that. Ministerial professional fee compensation for ministerial acts. Owner shall pay to 1% list a real estate commission in an amount equal to blank % of the gross purchase price of the property or blank flat fee. The ministerial fee is in addition to the listing agent broker commission as stated on the listing agreement. Payment terms shall remain as provided on the listing agreement. Basically, it's due at closing. Okay, so here's the thing. If you're going to tell me that you refuse to compensate a buyer, okay, like you refuse to compensate a buyer's agent, and now these buyers are going to come through with no agent, no help representing them, but I'm going to be expected to go out there and open doors for their inspectors. I'm going to be expected to open doors for them. I'm going to be expected to open the doors so they can do their final walkthrough and all that kind of stuff. You don't have to do that for free. You can tell them, look, you're going to pay this much more if that's the situation, because I'm going to have more work.
So what do you suggest as far as, I know there's obviously it's always negotiable, but what is your suggestion of, per showing fee or hour?
I'm probably going to charge 1% if I act as I'm not suggesting what to do, but I can tell you I charge 1% to list houses. And if I do ministerial acts, I'm going to charge another 1%. Something in there. You know, look, it's always negotiable, but as far as me, that's what I find is reasonable. Now,
So, Grant,
might
this
it be
document,
higher or might it be lower? It might be higher, it might be lower sometimes. It might be a flat fee sometimes. But
being the new listing agreement, you didn't say what the compensation they're willing to pay, though. It's not on there.
It's a blank.
give me 1 second, guys, okay?
Danny, there is not going to be a buyer agent compensation spot on the new listing agreement. That's the point of this addendum, is just to ask the seller if they're willing to compensate a buyer agent and that it's negotiated in the contract.
Yep.
In the ministerial acts portion that he's going over right now, that would refer to if a buyer comes to you fully unrepresented, you're going and you have to deal with everything along the way. There's no buyer agent involved. You charge an additional amount to the seller at closing. This is a part of the listing agreement.
Correct. There's basically 3 possibilities here. Possibility number 1 is there's another buyer. There's 2 agents. There's a listing agent and a buyer's agent. We're all familiar with that. Possibility number 2 is there's a dual agency situation. Okay, we're all pretty familiar with that. Possibility number 3 is that somebody cannot afford to pay a buyer's agent. And so they refused to sign a buyer rep agreement promising to pay somebody 2.5% because they can't afford to pay it, because they don't want to, or whatever other reason they invent. In that situation, it's our job to make sure our seller can get to a closing. Okay. We can't just tell these people, sorry, go kick rocks, agree to pay. Okay. We got to do our job for our fiduciary, but we don't have to do it for free. We simply tell our seller, look, you're not going to have to pay a buyer's agent the 2.5%, 3%, whatever they would request, but you are going to have to pay me an additional whatever you negotiate, because I'm going to wind up having to hold their hand. I'll give you a perfect example of what we saw. The person who wound up buying a house that I was doing ministerial acts for, they tried to prepare some of their own documents. One of them in the amendment, they did an amendment to the purchase agreement, and it said this: closing date to be 75 days. Well, 75 days from what? From the original purchase agreement? Or is it from midnight after the original purchase agreement signed? Is it 75 days from today? Is that including today? Or is that starting tomorrow? Like, who the hell knows? But that's the kind of stuff that people that are unrepresented do. And so you either say, well, sorry, they don't know how to do their stuff, so we're going to let this deal tank and blow up, and then I'm going to deal with the legal responsibility of that. Or you say, you know what, this is written really poorly. I'm going to clean this up so that you understand what you're trying to submit as an unrepresented buyer, but my seller understands the deadlines and what's going on here. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on any of this stuff? Our listing agreement was just condensed down to 1 page. I'll share a link to it. But this was condensed down to 1 page. It is very similar to the other one, but it's just down to 1 page, and we removed all mention of a cooperating broker, because frankly, it doesn't belong in here. This is an agreement between a seller and their listing agent, just like a buyer rep agreement is an agreement between a buyer and their buyer's agent. The whole point of all this is to keep a big wall in between those 2 parties. Okay. Let's see, we got questions. What's up? Let's see, Teresa.
Okay, I just wanted clarification when you were talking about the settlement statement and the commissions not being on there or them being held accountable. So they're currently on there now, even if a buyer's paying them. When I get, in the state of Alabama anyways, when I get my settlement statement, whoever's paying the commissions, it's on there. So I just want clarification going forward. If both parties are paying or one party paying, whatever, you're saying that neither party can truly be held responsible for paying and the deal like not close, even if it's on the settlement statement. Like, it can't be enforced. Maybe they don't know this, but you're telling us that. I mean,
what I'm saying is that the reason that it's always been in the settlement statement is because there was mechanisms for it. The main mechanism being is that money is being withheld from a seller's proceeds to pay those two agents' commissions.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So they're not going to put the buyers, if the buyers are responsible for paying, they can't put that on the settlement statement because what, their lender can't see it, or they just can't hold them responsible for it, or what? What's
Because
the
it has
reason?
nothing to do with that closing taking place. So let's say you have an agreement. I don't know. I mean, you can accept any form of payment you want. Let's say I got in a line on my screen, I got April, Teresa, and Lindsay. So you're representing April. April's buying a house. April promises to give you a big green egg if you represent her. Okay. That's not going anywhere near that purchase agreement. The purchase agreement is an agreement between a buyer and a seller.
Okay.
And so all those documents prepared by a title attorney are to consummate that sale. Your big green egg agreement with April has not a damn thing to do with that.
So
Now
if April doesn't bring a check, I'm just SOL and have to sue her.
that's the reason why it needs to be in a purchase agreement. Even if your buyer is going to compensate you directly, still needs to be part of the purchase agreement, because that purchase agreement cannot close unless all the terms of the purchase agreement are met. Because what's going to happen is you've got a lender who's lending money, most likely, and you've got a title company who's going to provide title insurance, and they are not going to be willing to do those things if there are terms of that agreement that are not met. So if the seller is going to compensate you, then you need to use that verbiage that we put in chat earlier today. But even if your buyer is going to compensate you at closing, I would put that in the contract.
So if it's in the contract, then it can be dangled as a little carrot. We can't close
The
until this.
contract, it has to happen.
Okay, gotcha. That cleared that up.
Basically, what I'm saying is if your buyer if you put it in the contract, buyer to compensate buyer's agent at closing, you get to a closing and they say, oh no, we changed our mind on that. Now you're defaulting on your purchase agreement because this is
Gotcha. That cleared it up. Thank you.
okay. April, what you got?
Okay, so the new
I
rider.
figured I'd ask you something groundbreaking because you always say, okay.
So my question is, the 85 listings that are out there now on August 17th, do we have to go back and now do these riders, or does anything change with them?
You're probably going to need to update your listing agreements, or at least do an amendment to it.
Okay.
And then the commission field is going to disappear.
Okay.
Okay. Holly, what you got?
Okay, so just to clarify, as long as it's in the contract, it is going to be written somewhere, even if it's not on the HUD, maybe just on the CD.
No, it won't be in any of those things.
But it still is going to be paid the same way at closing.
If the buyer is writing a check to you, then it's not going to be in the HUD or in the CD or any of those things. But
if the seller,
the title company to make sure that that gets satisfied, and the lender will also want to make sure that gets satisfied. And what's likely to happen is they're going to have to bring a cashier's check to the title company prior to the closing, for example. So that way the lender.
so buyer or seller is going to bring a cashier's check. It's not going to be out of their proceeds anymore.
Correct. It's no longer coming out of the seller's proceeds because the seller might not be paying it. But the main thing is make it a part of that contract. Look, I've negotiated, no BS, I've negotiated chickens, I've negotiated puppies, I've negotiated everything. Okay, and you can make that part of the contract. Like, I have negotiated a cute little puppy before for a house in Folsom. It was adorable. All right, so you can do these things. You just got to make it part of the contract.
So Grant, even if the seller's paying compensation, has agreed to do that, it's no longer going to come off the proceeds of the sale.
If the
Now the
seller's doing it,
seller's,
yes. If the seller's doing it, that will most likely remain in place. But if the buyer is going to pay for their own buyer's agent at closing, that's probably not going to show up anywhere in the closing disclosures in the settlement statement.
Yeah, well, we get that.
Lindsay, what you got?
But wouldn't the funds still be presented from the title company to the agent or to the brokerage?
I don't know how the title company is going to handle it. But what I would think is, but if I was a lender, if if I'm a title company, I'm not issuing title insurance. And if I'm a lender, then I'm having very strong feelings about being the first lien holder on somebody that is defaulting on another agreement with a party. That's like showing up to a closing and a seller saying, oh no, I didn't pay all my subs before they sold the house. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you don't want to be in that spot. And so making it a part of the contract is going to be important. I would think that if I'm running a title company, what I'm going to do is if I open up that contract and it says that the buyer is paying their buyer's agent this amount in the form of a cashier's check due at time of closing, I'm going to make that buyer show up with that check.
Correct.
Lindsay, what you got?
So if you're representing a buyer and for some crazy reason it's not in the purchase agreement, I think this kind of answered my question earlier, but they don't pay you, are we as a brokerage going to have some sort of policy or process in place where we like send them an invoice, it goes to collections, it harms their credit, or are we just kind of screwed?
It's a fantastic question. I don't know. It makes me feel bad that you work for the home office. So here's the thing. I mean, I can tell you that I was going to have to sue somebody in California, and it was going to cost me $50,000 to file an injunction. I can tell you that if there is verbiage in this stuff, that if we have to sue them, they are responsible for all legal fees. There is verbiage in this that states that. Do I want to go down that road? Probably not. What's most likely going to happen is it's going to go in front of Justice of the Peace Small Claims Court, and somebody's going to get $6,000. That's what's most likely going to happen. Just because, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had to sue anybody, but the moment that you're suing somebody, you're losing. And then the moment that you're getting sued, you lose even more. The only time that that's not the case is if you're injured in a big wreck and you need it checked, and you call one of the attorneys that'll take your case for free and give you a portion of what they make. There's a reason those dudes are riding around in Ferraris and have billboards everywhere. It's because they are making a killing. They're not charging their clients anything.
Yeah, like I have this like major concern. I don't know if anyone else shares it, but I work hard for my buyers, like way harder for my buyers than I do my listing clients. And if I did all of that work and got to closing and just had to leave empty-handed, I don't think I could make it in this industry for emotional reasons. Like that would drive me crazy to know that I could do all of this work and not get paid, and the title company's not going to put it in the papers, and nobody's going to stop the sale on my behalf.
I completely agree, Lindsay. And look, it needs to be tattooed on your brain that you're going to put the words we put in chat. Purchaser agrees to this, or buyer agrees to this. Like that needs to be something that is as common to you as putting a date on a contract. Okay, like it's got to be there.
So the title company cannot close the sale unless they hand us a check at closing in that instance.
Correct. It needs to be a party. It needs to be a part of the sale.
And I guess I agree with Grant. I think
you have to pay me at active sale. If you don't, you're defaulting on the agreement.
I agree, and I also agree, no personal check, cashier's check only.
If it's in the contract, a lender is going to also see it in the contract. So if there's any issues with financing due to it, that should be a first phone call from a lender saying this buyer does not have money to do this. So you're not going to the closing table and the buyer all of a sudden saying, hey, I don't have the money to pay this and now I'm in default. Put every single thing in the contract, just like leaving a refrigerator. Everything should be in the contract.
So the sale in that case would just not happen. Everybody would go home and no sale.
No, what would happen is your buyer has now defaulted on their agreement and they're responsible for all commissions plus 10% of the value of the home.
But if the purchase agreement is simply an agreement to purchase a home, this agreement, you think it's allowed for the agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent to become part of this agreement that really just involves the buyer buying the seller's house? Do you get where I'm going?
I do. And once again, I've negotiated chickens, puppies, like you name it, I put it in a purchase agreement.
So
I mean,
we are clear that that is allowed. There's no question there.
absolutely. You could,
Okay.
you know, the verbiage is purchaser requests that seller compensate buyer's agent. I mean, it's something that we had earlier. I don't remember. I'll copy it again, but that's what needs to go in. If you're requesting to be paid by the purchaser, here it is. But if they are not going to compensate you and the buyer is going to compensate their own agent, then it needs to be put in there. Buyer to compensate buyer's agent for X amount or X percent of gross sales price per buyer per mutually agreed buyer broker agreement or something along those lines, where it is part of the contract. In order to close, you have to do this. You know, it has to be done. What you got, Lance?
Hey, Grant, can you hear me?
Of course.
Okay. Two questions real quick. One, I kind of concur on it. Where in the contract, you keep referring to purchase agreement, or you're referring to a contract, correct?
I'm sorry, what was that, Lance?
You referring to purchase agreements.
Yeah.
You know, that's really the contract.
Yep.
Correct?
Yeah, purchase agreement, correct.
Where would you put that in a contract?
It'll be in the additional terms and conditions.
Yeah. Special provisions?
Yeah, so in Louisiana, we have an area that says additional terms and conditions.
In Texas, it's called special provisions.
There you go, same thing.
And special provisions, and we have been trained by Texas realtors, attorneys, do not write anything in there. Allow the client to write it in there. So I'm kind of confused where we put any of that.
I don't know. I suspect a lot of states are going to update their purchase agreements to have a specific spot for these things.
Okay.
But until they do, it just needs to be in your purchase agreement somewhere. Either as a clearly attached addendum.
I would do it.
Or written somewhere where there's blank lines for these sorts of things, anything like that. Catherine Racine asks, may I ask why purchaser's request versus seller two, as we currently do in asking for closing costs? Really, it's splitting hairs, Catherine, but the guidance we've gotten from NAR as well as attorneys and everything else is the most clear way to have it is that purchasers request seller to compensate purchaser's agent. And the reason is because when a purchaser reads that, it's making it clear that they are requesting that fee be paid by the seller to us instead of them paying it to us. We've had numerous attorneys say, you know, is it push comes to shove, is it that different? No, but it's just a more clear way when just a normal person reads that, they would read, oh, I'm requesting that the seller compensate you rather than you requesting that from the seller or anybody else. I'm requesting that the seller compensate you rather than me compensate you. I mean, they've just said it's more clear, and I tend to agree. April Horn, what you got?
If we have existing buyers under contract that will close after August 17th, do we need an amendment stating what the commission is being paid by the sellers, or is there a grace period?
I don't believe so. I think anything that went under contract prior to these changes, you're good.
Okay.
I'm having all of my agents download a copy of the MLS sheet, current MLS sheet for all under contract properties from now until August 17th when it drops off, putting it in their loop and then sending a copy to the title company.
Yep.
Great idea.
Jim Jones asked, are the 7-day viewing forms like Zillow is using acceptable to use? He would think so since Zillow is using them. I understand why you would think that, but at the end of the day, I don't believe Zillow is having licensed agents from other brokerages use those forms. I think that's just the markets where Zillow actually has an agent presence. And so here's the thing. I would not use those forms that Zillow put out. Zillow is not a brokerage. Zillow's not, well, they are, but I mean, they aren't a national brokerage like Keller Williams or Remax or something like that. So I would hesitate to just blindly use Zillow's forms. If you're gonna do it, I would definitely provide it to, you know, your broker, team lead, whoever else, and say, hey, is it cool if I use this before you use somebody else's forms? And look, we've provided links to all of our forms. You guys are welcome to take them and do whatever, but I would not use them until your broker says, yeah, those are cool to use. Even if you work for my company and you're under Stacia, I would say, hey, Stacia, this is what I'm going to start using. Is that cool? You know, I would definitely do that before you put anything out in the wild. Any other questions? How many of y'all are just freaked out right now? Probably a bunch. Tell Lindsay has all the confidence. She is not freaked out at all. I can see it in her face. She's like, look at me. I laugh in the face of controversy.
I think I'm going to need flashcards, laminated flashcards to present to buyers when I go show them a house to explain who I represent.
Can I make a very simple, look, well, I'm sure we'll do this anyways, but you know, we have a podcast studio where me and Sam make content. What we'll probably do is we'll make a very simple video explaining these things, which you guys are welcome to use.
Great.
You guys are welcome to use and share and all those things, but it might not hurt if you have a very simple video. And look, in a lot of times you don't need to, it doesn't need to look like a Michael Bay film in order to have one of these videos. Just sit down in front of your phone, you know, have it stationary where it's not wobbling all over the place, and just on a very personal one-on-one level, just explain it. You know, it's where, in my opinion, where people always get in trouble is where we have a quote unquote understanding. When you have an understanding, that's where people are not on the same page. But when expectations are laid out, when you explain what you do, how you do it, why you do it, okay, then people don't get frustrated because they understand what they're agreeing to before they agree to it. It's when expectations are not met and when expectations are not clear, that's when people get frustrated. So once again, just be transparent. You know, if you're only available from, you know, 9 to 3 on weekdays and you're not available on weekends, tell your client that. If they're cool with it, great. Just whatever you do, don't say, look, I'm going to be at your beck and call 24/7, and then you're never available to show houses. You never answer the damn phone, and don't present it to them. Say, oh, don't worry, the seller's going to pay me. And then you get to the point where they're not. And then you got to go to Stacia or somebody and say, hey, Stacia, we got to sue this client. Well, why do we need to sue them? Because they refused to pay me. And then Stacia talks to them and they said, oh no, they promised that the seller was going to pay this and I wasn't responsible for it. Because then I got news for you. You just wasted a lot of your time. You know, Mary, what you got?
So this is maybe a big question, but you know, real estate agents are who pays into NAR and keeps NAR afloat, I believe.
Yeah.
So why isn't the real estate agents now suing NAR for this incredibly damaging lawsuit? Because I just don't see why there's not a countersuit.
Okay, I'll answer this question, but it'll be controversial. I don't think we are in this position because NAR is not representing the agents, the realtors. I think we're in this position because NAR did too good of a job protecting the realtors. And that's why the Department of Justice got involved, and that's why the government got involved. I mean, I don't find it that hard to state my case on this. Housing prices have gone through the roof. We have gone, for those of us who've been in the industry for a while, we've gone from 50-50 or 60-40 splits to now we have 100% brokerages everywhere. And now the commission is somehow still the same. We have, to give you an idea, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 lenders in the country and 2 million real estate agents. I don't think the problem is that NAR is just running a toxic cesspool that makes nobody want to be in the business. I think they've done such a damn good job that everybody wants to be in the business and everybody feels like it's easy money and they can just do whatever. They did too good of a job, NAR, in my opinion. And that's why the DOJ came down on them, and that's why everybody got sued. They surpassed expectations for protecting the industry from the clients. And that's part of where I have issue anyways. It's like, I don't want, you're welcome to disagree with me. It says Agent 1PL. I don't even know who you are, but you're welcome to disagree. That's fine. But I don't need anybody to protect me from my fiduciary. And whenever me and Kelly sat down and made these documents, I did not make them thinking, ooh, how do I protect myself from my clients? I did not think that at all. And so that's my 2 cents. Is it Malia?
Yeah, you got it.
Got it right second time. What's up?
Okay, so I'm thinking I may have oversimplified this to myself, but this is so a lot of people are asking, like, if we don't on the front end have a seller agree to, let's say, 2.5% for a buyer's agent commission.
Okay.
If we don't have that on the front end, how do we know that the seller is going to stick to that? I literally, I don't know, I think like 17 days ago, I listed a house and they said they were not going to do any upfront buyer's agent compensation.
Mhm.
And so when I said, are we going to offer buyer's agent commission? And they said no. I said, okay, no problem. That is what you choose to do. However, just so that I know going forward, would you guys be willing to negotiate that into a contract with agents? Because agents are going to ask, what if we do this? Would they then be willing to offer buyer's agent commission? For example, the house is listed for $100,000. If we offer $102,000, would they be willing to give that $2,000 back in commission to the buyer to use towards the buyer's agent? Basically like closing costs, but
I can tell you how I explain it. I would have a buyer rep agreement signed with what I want to be paid, obviously. Okay. But if I'm the listing agent, here's how I always explain this to my sellers, because we've been telling sellers for a very long time, look, you don't have to compensate a buyer's agent. There's nothing requiring you to do so. We've been saying that for years. And yet probably 99.9% of our listings do. And the reason we do is we just explain this to them. You're not required to compensate a buyer's agent. There is no set fee. There's no standard. Now then, that said, there's 7,000 agents in the greater New Orleans market. What's the odds that I am going to bring you the one that has the best offer? Almost all of them are running around with an agent. What's the odds that you're going to pull the best offer from an agent that is completely unrepresented? Okay, the odds of that is very low. And I explained to them, look, you're my fiduciary. My job is to get you the best possible price for your house and to get you the closing terms and deadlines that you want met. That's my job. And I'm telling you, the best way to do that is to have an open mind about it. Okay. And
yeah, so that's what I did with them, and they agreed. They said, depending on the offer, we will offer buyer's agent compensation, but it has to be written into the contract and it has to be a negotiable term.
Yeah, exactly.
So my question is, am I oversimplifying it? Basically, so what I put in chat, I said, and so you go to your seller, an offer comes in with blank commission requested. The seller then would make an advised by me decision on if they're willing to compensate that amount based on that offer. The seller and I discuss the offer. Hey, the buyers are requesting X for buyer's agent compensation, Y for a home warranty policy, Z for a septic pump out inspection. Based on offer M, you are set to net in money at the end of this agreement. Are you happy with that and that net amount, or do we need to renegotiate some of these terms? Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you tell them, hey, look, the net proceeds, that's an estimate based on the approximate payoff that you gave me when we started this whole process and we discussed this. And then I also added, I don't know if everybody's using net proceed sheets. It's made my life easier, especially for sellers who are like, no, I have to make X number of dollars in order to buy what I'm buying next. Have I oversimplified that process in my head?
No, I think that's exactly what you should be doing. Okay, you should look at it and you should throw out all possibilities. Why it's popping up like that? Am I sharing my screen? Somebody else sharing their screen? Somebody's sharing their Jim. Why are you sharing your screen, dude?
Me?
Yeah, you're sharing your screen.
I have no.
Stop sharing your screen, dude.
You say Jeff or Jim?
No, Jim. Jim is. Hang on. Let me find him down here. I can make that stop, I think. There. We'll kick him out. Get out of here, Jim. He can rejoin. But no, I think that's a very simple way of doing it is you just explain to them, look, I think you should have an open mind to it. And by saying yes, that doesn't mean you're agreeing to a number. It doesn't even mean that you have to do it. It just means that you're open to it. Okay. You know, and that's all that matters is, but just having the authority and having the confidence to fully explain that to them is important. And this might sound crazy because this is so different than what most agents do. It's not your job to be their friend. It's not your job to be a yes person. It's your job to represent them. And so I've had more than I could possibly remember times in my career where a seller or a buyer has told me, well, I'm doing this. And I tell them, okay, great. If that's what you're instructing me to do, that's what we're going to do. But I'm telling you, that's a horrible idea. And this is why. And if they're still of that mindset, okay, great. Make me do it. And I'm going to do it because I work for you. And I tell them, look, at the end of the day, if you tell me, you know, to write a $500,000 offer on this house that's listed for 400, that's what I'm going to do if you tell me that. But I'm going to tell you that's dumb. But at the end of the day, I work for you.
Grant, I have one last question on that, on the listing agreement that we're doing and the ministerial duties. How does that differ from dual agency?
Because you're not, so with dual agency, I don't like the term dual agency because dual agency means you're an agent and a fiduciary for both parties, which you cannot be. Okay. How I explain it in that form is I cease to be in a dual agency situation. I am no longer a fiduciary for one party. I'm a mediator between both parties. Okay. Which I think is a much simpler way of explaining it. In ministerial acts, you are still representing your seller. The buyer has written acknowledgement that you are not representing them in either way, in any way. You're just assisting with deadlines, paperwork, opening the house, things like that. Things that you would not normally do if there's another agent. You're simply assisting with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you're not really, are you doing any of the paperwork for them like you do in dual though? Like
you might assist them in the creation of it, but you're not assisting them at all with what goes in it. And so how this would work is this. Danny, you're self-representing. I'm doing ministerial acts and Jeff is my seller. So I'm representing Jeff Sonnenberg no matter what to the end. He's my only client. But Danny, you don't know how to fill out a purchase agreement. So I'll assist you in filling it out. And when it comes down to, well, what are we going to offer? What would you like to offer, Danny? Well, I don't know. What do the comps say? Danny, I don't represent you. I'm not here to show you the comps. I'm not here to assist you with that in any way. I'm here to write down whatever you would like to offer in the offer portion. So what would you like to offer? Well, what do you think they'll take? I don't know, Danny. I don't represent you. I'm not here to act as your fiduciary. I am here to assist you in filling out this paperwork. You know, when it gets down to the point with, you know, financing conditions, Danny, what financing terms would you like in here? What do you suggest? I would suggest you have a conversation with your lender and whatever they say to put in here, that's what we're going to put. So how did that conversation go?
who pays that 1% though? Does the seller pay that?
The seller is paying you your 1%. And honestly, in that situation, it's a hairy situation to be in. I've been in one recently. I didn't like it, but it's going to happen because there's a lot of people that can't afford to write a check for 2.5 or 3% at a closing, which means they're not going to sign or they're not going to want to sign a buyer rep agreement, which means ministerial acts is going to become a lot more common. And so people need to be proficient at providing factual information without trying to interpret it for them. Okay, you can provide factual information. You can share the information on the MLS. You can help them meet deadlines, things like that. You can open doors, you can do those things, but it's not your job to talk about what they should ask for in an inspection response and word that in such a way that really leverages it for the buyer. That's not your job. Holly, what you got?
I'm not sure anymore.
Fair enough. I'm not either.
I had a question, but then we went that way with it.
You
I
good?
was gonna ask, but I think you just answered it. So we basically are allowed to just fill out the contract for them. But what if they're putting something in the contract that you know is gonna cause a problem?
That's where it gets.
I mean,
That's where it gets hairy.
5-day inspection period, and you know that's not going to be possible, and it's going to cause controversy. Are we allowed to explain what the purchase agreement says about inspection, or we just say you need to read this?
So I got news for you. The ministerial acts that I did recently, in the inspection, there was a driveway that was supposed to be fixed. Guess what we had without it being fixed? A closing. All right, I was representing the seller. Okay, they drafted up an inspection response. That's what they asked for. Okay, do you think I did a final walkthrough to make sure all those things were taken care of for that buyer? No, that's not my buyer. Not my fault, not my problem. You represent yourself. You need to check and see if that driveway was fixed. And if it's not and you closed on it, guess what? That's your new driveway. You go fix it. Do you understand how we can handle that now?
Yes.
And I got news for you. For those of you who think that this won't happen, don't take my word for it. Call a lender. Okay? And just say, look, for an average buyer, how many of them can afford to write a check for 2.5% to 3% at closing to their buyer's agent? Okay? And they can't. Now, I understand that the response is going to be, well, it's okay, because we're going to get the seller to pay. But if you are buying your first home, are you going to trust that? Or are you going to sign a legal document requiring you to write a check you cannot cash? You don't have the money to cover it. You can barely afford to get in the house. Okay? I think a lot of people be scared to sign that document, especially if they read it. Why do you think the Department of Justice came down and said you cannot have a 6-page long impossible to read document? People need to understand what they're signing.
I remember what my other question was. It's a little bit different topic, but so I know what my seller is going to ask when they say, yes, we're willing to pay on the listing agreement. We're willing to pay compensation. We check that box. What am I likely to pay? And I know right now I'm able to look in the MLS and say, well, here's everything in your neighborhood, and they're paying 2%. This listing's paying 2.5.
But you're
So
not going to
that
be able
goes
to do that
away.
because it's not going to be in the MLS anymore.
So what is my answer to that going to be? Can I still say, well, in the past, this is what was prevalent? Am I opening myself up for?
No, I would say, look, this is what we would always see a range of between this and this in the past, and that's what's most likely to happen. But the whole point is understand it's negotiable. And so, dear seller, if somebody writes us an amazing offer and they ask for a commission that's a little bit crazy and too high, you know what? I encourage you to only think about your bottom line. But if negotiations get really tight and we're fighting and you're up against your bottom line and they're up against their bottom line, you can negotiate that the buyer's commission as well. You're not stuck paying 2.5. Absolutely. Thank you for coming, Catherine. I appreciate your input. I mean, look, everything's negotiable.
So I'm okay to say in the past, this was the range. This is what you can expect, but understand everything's negotiable.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, somewhere in this range, but who knows? It could come in way higher, way lower, and everything is negotiable. And we're going to make sure you get the best number you can. What was that?
And Holly, when it comes to a non-represented buyer wanting to submit an offer with no representation, we've had several of those this year anyway. That listing addendum already covers you for what you're going to get paid by the seller at closing. You negotiated that with the seller or stipulated that with the seller when you took the listing. So you're covered there in regards to compensation. In regards to
Meaning
the contract,
the ministerial acts?
yes, ministerial or dual agency is already covered in the front end. So that's not even a negotiating tactic in the contract anymore because it's in the listing agreement. In regards to that non-represented buyer, what I've done in the past is, and I had a buyer that says, I don't want to be represented. I want to offer on this. I would email them the actual Louisiana contract in whatever state you're in. Here's the contract. This is what is required by our state to be used. And if they can't fill it out themselves, or they choose to fill out themselves, regardless, you can counter that with corrections that might need to legally be made. Now, if it's an inspection period, that's on that buyer. So you don't advise them at all. If they put a 3-day inspection period, that's on them. You just go roll with the contract as it's going. But in regards to anything that you know has to be written differently in the contract, and we've had many of those this year, you just counter it with the corrections. Does that make sense?
Yes, sorry, I had myself muted. I was saying yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'm going to shut off the recording now.